Hey everyone, and welcome. If you're one of our focus learners wanting to understand exactly how the modern world was shaped, well, you are in the perfect place. Today, we're diving into a really dynamic explainer on the true history of feminism. We're not going to look at this as just one single monolithic event, because honestly, it's not. Instead, we're going to explore it as a thrilling, constantly evolving series of hard-fought waves. We'll be walking through the massive breakthroughs, the absolutely fierce pioneers, and, yeah, the painful setbacks that define this entire movement. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of this fight, we really have to look at the baseline women were starting from. So, the French Revolution of 1789 happened, right? And it brought this glorious promise of equality. But that equality was strictly for men. Just listen to Napoleon's 1804 Civil Code. It legally enforced that women were essentially eternal minors. They passed directly from the control of their fathers right to their husbands. We're talking no high school, no jobs, no traveling without permission. It is a completely jarring juxtaposition, isn't it? A society that just overthrew a king in the name of liberty, yet legally codified the absolute obedience of half its entire population?
Section 1. The origins of the fight. The pioneers of the revolution. Because, you really can't spark a massive revolution and expect women not to notice the hypocrisy. So let's look at the earliest trailblazers who outright refused to accept being shut out of the new republic's civic life.
This whole era was totally plagued by a two steps forward, one step back reality. Back in 1791, a brilliant self-educated woman named Olympe de Gouge published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. She literally took the foundational text of the Republic and just rewrote it to include women. And her activism actually led to a minor miracle in 1792 when the right to divorce was finally legalized. But progress was incredibly fragile. De Gouge was deeply critical of the regime's violence, and she tragically paid for her progressive ideas at the guillotine in 1793. And then, sadly, by 1816, that hard-won right to divorce was completely revoked.
Moving on to Section 2. First wave. The vote. The fight for public rights. That early foundation really sets the stage for what historians call the first wave. As we head into the late 19th and early 20th century, the main battleground becomes the public sphere. The ultimate prize here? The fundamental right to vote.
And this brilliantly illustrates how this movement was driven by absolute powerhouses of character. Let's look at Hubertine Auclert and Madeleine Pelletier. Auclert was actually the first to reclaim the word feminist. She used completely unapologetic provocation. She famously went on a tax strike, arguing, hey, if I don't have the right to vote on the budget, why on earth should I pay into it? Makes perfect sense, right? Then you have Madeleine Pelletier, who dressed in men's clothing to protest rigid gender norms. In 1902, she literally forced her way into a psychiatry exam that required political rights she wasn't allowed to have. And by 1910, she was getting political parties to run female candidates in local elections, even though it was totally illegal. They broke the rules to force society to finally listen.
But man, the wait for the ballot box was agonizingly long. From those initial promises in 1789, through the failures of the 1848 revolution, the delays just kept coming. When World War I broke out, women stepped up. They ran the factories, they built the munitions while the men were at the front. The bitter irony, though, when the war ended, they were pushed right back into the kitchen. In 1919, the lower house did finally vote for women's suffrage, but the Senate just dragged their feet and rejected it. It actually wasn't until the end of World War II, in 1944, which is over a century and a half after the revolution, that French women were finally granted the right to vote.
Which brings us to Section 3, Second Wave, the body, the liberation of the private sphere. Earning the vote was a huge victory, for sure. But as we move into the post-World War II era and the 1960s, the battleground shifts radically, away from the ballot box and directly into women's bodies and the home.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how clearly it contrasts the shifting goals of the movement. See, the first wave was all about that public column, voting, getting an education, working. But the second wave, it zeroes right in on the private column. All of this was happening against the backdrop of the 1950s baby boom, where government propaganda was heavily pushing this image of the perfect domestic housewife. Second-wave feminists argued that you can't truly participate in public life if you have zero control over your own private life. They were fighting for access to contraception, abortion, and completely rejecting those forced domestic stereotypes.
And the intellectual foundation for this massive shift was laid by philosopher Simone de Beauvoir in her 1949 book, The Second Sex. She intellectually detonated the whole idea of biological destiny. She argued that femininity, at least how society understood it back then, wasn't some innate biological given. Actually, it was a restrictive social construction specifically designed to keep women in an inferior, dependent role.
120,000. I just want to pause for a second and let that massive number sink in. According to our sources, that is the estimated number of clandestine abortions happening every single year in France before legalization. Because it was entirely illegal, women were forced into these unsafe back alley procedures, and the consequences were often deadly. The law was just completely disconnected from the actual reality of women's lives.
But in response to that tragedy, we get a much smaller but incredibly powerful number, 343. In 1971, 343 women, and we're talking massive celebrities here, like Catherine Deneuve and writer Marguerite Duras, bravely signed a manifesto drafted by Simone de Beauvoir. By putting their names on that paper, they publicly admitted they had had an abortion. They were effectively daring the government to arrest them and risk an absolute public relations disaster.
This triggered a relentless chain reaction. First, you had the manifesto, which completely shattered the public silence. Then came the famous Bobigny trial in 1972. Here, lawyer Gisèle Halimi successfully defended a 17-year-old girl charged with having an abortion, basically putting the unjust law itself on trial. This immense public pressure finally forced the government's hand. That brings us to 1974, when Simone Veil, the newly appointed Minister of Health and a Holocaust survivor, stood up and faced down a hostile, deeply conservative, male-dominated National Assembly to present a bill decriminalizing abortion. And against all odds, she succeeded, fundamentally changing healthcare and women's autonomy forever.
Let's jump into Section 4, Intersectionality and Gender, Rethinking Norms and Oppressions. As we transition into the academic and theoretical evolution of the 1990s, the movement begins to critically examine its own blind spots.
So, the crucial point is how this new definition of gender completely revolutionized the conversation. Philosopher Judith Butler proposed that gender isn't an innate biological truth. Instead, it's more like a performance, a set of behaviors we learn and act out just to conform to society's expectations. By uncoupling gender from biological sex, Butler challenged strict heteronormativity and really opened the door wide for LGBT+ inclusion within the feminist fight.
Right around the exact same time, legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined a totally vital term, intersectionality. Building on the earlier work of fierce activists like Angela Davis, Crenshaw pointed out a pretty glaring flaw. See, mainstream feminism was mostly built around the experiences of white, middle-class, heterosexual women. But what if you're a black woman or a working-class woman? You aren't just experiencing sexism, you're experiencing this complex overlap of racism, classism, and sexism, all at the exact same time. This concept completely revolutionized the movement, demanding a framework that actually represents these overlapping oppressions.
Okay, Section 5, the #MeToo tidal wave, the end of systemic silence. All those decades of theory, legal battles, and shifting social norms, they set the absolute foundation for the explosive arrival of a modern reckoning that tackled systemic gender-based violence on a truly global scale. In October 2017, explosive revelations came out about Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. Just a few days later, actress Alyssa Milano posted a simple but incredibly powerful request. She asked anyone who had experienced harassment or assault to just reply to her tweet with "Me Too." Now, it is vitally important that we impartially credit activist Toronto Burke here. She actually created the Me Too phrase and movement a whole decade earlier, in 2007, to help survivors in marginalized communities. But Milano's tweet, that acted as the spark to set the digital world on absolute fire. The result was just staggering. 500,000. In a mere 24 hours, that hashtag was used 500,000 times. It proved to the entire world the horrific ubiquity of the issue. This wasn't just some Hollywood problem. It was an everywhere problem. The systemic silence had finally, truly broken. Let's move to and see how this builds into the French context. 2 days before Milano's tweet, French journalist Sandra Muller launched the hashtag Balance Ton Pour, which translates roughly to expose your pig. What made this distinctly aggressive was that Muller's hashtag didn't just ask women to share their pain, it actively encouraged them to publicly name their aggressors and detail their workplace harassment. It completely ripped away the shield of anonymity that abusers had been hiding behind for decades.
And as you'll see, this digital tidal wave quickly materialized into highly visible, real-world protests. Institutions literally had nowhere left to hide. In 2019, Chilean activists created the viral protest anthem, "A Rapist in Your Path," and that spread globally like wildfire. Then in 2020, French actress Adèle Hanel walked out of the César Film Awards to protest a convicted director winning an award, sparking the rallying cry, "We stand up and we leave." On top of that, the movement forced systemic linguistic shifts. It brought terms like femicide, which is the killing of women specifically because they are women, right into mainstream legal and journalistic language.
To see how this long history directly impacts the world we live in right now, we really only need to look at the 2024 Gisèle Pellicot trial in France, which is heavily cited in our source material. This is a harrowing case where a woman was drugged by her husband and assaulted by dozens of men over years. It completely shocked the world. But more importantly, it forced society to confront a really uncomfortable reality. It shattered the myth of the monster hiding in a dark alley. The abusers identified in this trial, they were ordinary men. Fathers, neighbors, colleagues, just hiding in plain sight. It proves that the societal work surrounding consent and gender-based violence is still far from over.
So, what does this all mean for us today? From Olympe de Gouge facing the guillotine, to Simone Veil staring down a hostile assembly, to the millions of voices roaring in the #MeToo movement, the true history of feminism is a story of just immense, undeniable courage. But here's the thing, rights are never permanently guaranteed. They require constant vigilance. The wave of progress doesn't just move on its own. It requires active participation from all of us. So as history is written every single day, how will you protect these hard-won rights? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.